Good afternoon. My name is Richard Berkman. As chair of AJC's National Board of Governors, I'm delighted to introduce AJC's annual Great Debate. There are few global forum programs that inspire as much interest, discussion, and yes, debate than the one we're about to witness. One question on every repeat attendee's mind is invariably, so what do you think they're going to debate this year? Last year, it was the battle between synagogue and state in Israel. The year before that, it was Barney Frank versus Bill Kristol on the 2012 presidential election. In 2011, Yossi Klein Halevi took on Peter Beinart on the tension or lack thereof between liberalism and Zionism. But the year it all started was 2010, when Roger Cohen of the New York Times and Bret Stephens of the Wall Street Journal went head-to-head on Iran. Everyone loves a rematch, and that's exactly what you're going to get this afternoon. And the truth is there couldn't be a subject more worthy of debate at this moment in time. AJC is unabashedly an advocacy organization, and on Iran, we don't pretend to hide our position. Preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability is the #1 issue on the AJC advocacy agenda, and we believe it must be on the top of the world's agenda as well. But AJC is also a believer in the potential power of diplomacy. And therefore, the question at the center of today's debate, the interim deal with Iran, path to progress or road to ruin, is one we have had to confront internally as well as externally. In the end, only time and tangible deeds will determine whether or not the interim deal is indeed a path to progress or a road to ruin. But in the meanwhile, we'll continue to monitor, debate, and discuss among ourselves, including here today. But before our debaters and esteemed moderator Jason Isaacson, director of AJC's Office of Government and International Affairs, comes out on the stage, we have a short video to fill you in on the last go-round and set the stage for round 2. Enjoy the video and the debate.
Iran must on no account be allowed to acquire either a nuclear weapon or what's called a threshold capability for nuclear weapons.
Iran could pursue a limited, monitored, civilian and peaceful nuclear program if it comes clean with the international community.
You can't engage a regime whose central ideological pillar is to hate you.
The military option is a terrible option, a near unthinkable one.
I see this election as a kind of protest against what's going on in Iran during the last 4 years.
We have to not constantly assume that it's not possible for Iran, like any country, to change over time. It may not be likely. I wouldn't say that it's more than 50-50.
Good afternoon, good evening, those of you who are watching us on the web and on JLTV. How fitting that we are debating the possibility of a negotiated end to the Iranian nuclear threat the day after Foreign Minister Fabius, standing right there, told the AJC Global Forum opening plenary session, "It is clear that we shall not allow Iran to obtain nuclear weapons." And how fitting that we are conducting this debate on the very day that P5+1 negotiators and their Iranian counterparts have resumed talks in Vienna, with the hope of concluding a final agreement this summer. This discussion couldn't be more timely. This issue, as Rick Berkman has just reminded us, more worthy of debate. 4 years ago, Roger Cohen and Bret Stephens faced off against each other on this very stage in the first round of the AJC Great Debate on Iran. A lot has happened in these last 4 years. After more than a decade of unilateral US sanctions and multiple UN Security Council resolutions that had seemed to have little impact on Iranian decision-making, and with Iran's nuclear program expanding, the European Union joined the United States in adopting severe economic and energy sanctions on Iran. The sanctions bit hard. Then last year, the Iranian people elected a new president committed to sanctions relief, which yielded the negotiated interim nuclear joint plan of action that the P5+1 great powers on Iran signed last fall, and the talks that are underway today toward a comprehensive deal. We have questions about that interim deal and questions about the possibility of achieving a comprehensive deal that fulfills the promise of Foreign Minister Fabius, as well as of President Obama and other leaders of the P5+1, and is not the bad deal that Senator McCain warned us about last night. So, let us begin on the merits or perils of that interim deal with Roger Cohen first and then Bret Stephens. Roger.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Well, now that you've seen that video, you can tell how little Bret and I have aged in the intervening 4 years. It's 4 years, as you know, since Bret and I last debated Iran at this venue. Since then, one of the big changes is that he has won a Pulitzer Prize. So, congratulations on that. And so I guess the odds are stacked against me in this rematch. And as Bret said outside, let's hope this is Godfather 2 and not Godfather 3. I said at that time, 4 years ago, what a mild-mannered, good-looking guy Bret is, and suggested that his penchant for bellicosity was far from evident in his appearance. Well, he is tough. I had confirmation of that last night when I arrived after an exhausting 8-hour transatlantic flight here at the Grand Hyatt, only to be told that there were no more rooms left for me, and I would have to sleep in a conference room on a fold-out sofa. Aha, was my immediate thought, that wily Bret Stephens again. Thanks, by the way, to the AJC and particularly John Schweitzer for rescuing me from that quandary. So here we are, 4 years on, with the Iranian nuclear question unresolved, and still about the most divisive foreign policy issue in Washington. Has anything changed? Well, Iran has 19,000 centrifuges and rising, producing low-enriched uranium, about double what it had in 2010. The presidency has changed. Iran has a president, Hassan Rouhani, who's a tough regime insider, but also a measured man who's called for prudent moderation in foreign policy. Instead of that, foul-tongued, loose cannon Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who, it should be noted, ladies and gentlemen, turned out to be inconsequential, an inconsequential figure, a reminder that with Iran it's important to remain cool and watch actions rather than words. We also have senior American and Iranian officials talking to each other consistently for the first time since the Iranian Revolution, the first time in more than 3 decades. And as a result of that, we have the Joint Action Plan, or Interim nuclear deal, between Iran and 6 world powers, crafted principally by the United States in secret meetings. Now, this has been dismissed as a historic mistake by Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, who has also called Rouhani a wolf in sheep's clothing, and has suggested to you, to all of us, to American Jews, that the deal will mean an Iranian nuclear warhead coming to a theater near you. Well, the Iran debate has never lacked for hyperbole. Bret over here, in my view, has not been averse to it. He alludes from time to Second Holocausts and Munich, 1938, analogies with which we should be very careful at the risk of dishonoring the dead. Now, why is this interim deal a potential path to progress rather than a road to ruin? Because it is better than any conceivable alternative. The perfect, ladies and gentlemen, must not be the enemy of the good. It is not all we would wish for, this potential deal, but it's better than any other option I can see. And if Bret thinks otherwise, he must present to you that alternative and persuade you of its wisdom, because this joint action plan has already achieved quite a lot. Now, you remember that cartoonish diagram that Prime Minister Netanyahu displayed at the UN with its red line at 90% enrichment? Well, thanks to this interim deal, Iran is eliminating its 20% enriched uranium through conversion or other means. It's halting the centrifuge multiplication I already alluded to. It's not adding to its low enriched uranium, which is well below weapons grade. It's halted work on the Arak reactor, a potential source of plutonium, and talks are underway to make Arak proliferation-proof. It has agreed to the most intensive IAEA inspections regime ever, unprecedented in intensity and scope. All this places Iran farther from potential breakout, farther from a bomb, and that is good for Israel and good for the world. Now, what about its medium-term potential? The objective now must be to ring-fence and reduce Iran's acquired capacity in a long-term agreement, so as to ensure that it is left only with a transparent, highly monitored civilian nuclear program with the number of its centrifuges and current uranium stockpile slashed and production of plutonium, potential production of plutonium at Arak headed off. The task is to define, in the words of two former secretaries of state, a level of Iranian nuclear capacity limited to plausible civilian uses and to achieve safeguards to ensure that this level is not exceeded. Now, who were those two former secretaries of state? They were Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, not two doves by any means. Now, this will be very tough, extremely tough, but it is doable. And if done, Israel, the region, and the world will be safer. We may dream of complete Iranian nuclear dismantlement, but in the real world, that can no longer be achieved. Iran now has know-how that cannot be reversed, let alone bombed out of existence. So put the mutually defined enrichment program, now conceded by the Obama administration, in a verifiable, contained, and controlled box, and don't trust them an inch. Verify, verify, verify. Well, what's the alternative? Let's be clear. The only real alternatives to this deal are war or a nuclear Iran. We know what will happen absent agreement and absent war. More of the same. More centrifuges, more enriched uranium, larger stockpiles, more hidden sites. Iran may hold back a little from a bomb itself, but will be so close as to make little difference. And war, which I suspect Bret is about to propose, it would be a disaster. It would set Iran back perhaps 6 months or a year. Iran would push the IAEA out. It would rush for a bomb. What would happen in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq? Israel would be less secure and more hated. In short, any war would be grossly disproportionate to any possible gain. Another war in that region. At that point, the United States would have been to war from the western border of Iraq, all across some 3,000 miles to the eastern border of Afghanistan. And then we will try to tell the Arab and Persian worlds that we do not hate Muslims. Ladies and gentlemen, after 2 failed wars, we owe it to ourselves to reflect deeply on any such option. What about the possibility of political change in Iran? Well, war entrenches the hardliners. contact with the world over time undermines the regime and favors Iranian youth, those who were oppressed ferociously in 2009. Iran is an urbanized, highly educated society, and the more contact with the world there is, the more chance there is of gradual change. And what of the United States? Well, this country is tired of war. After Iraq, after Afghanistan, we saw that with Syria, where the president drew a red line, marched everyone up the hill, and then marched us down again. And that's a very dangerous thing when the United States sets red lines and doesn't heed them. But in the current situation, the United States must exhaust every diplomatic option. And that's the process underway with this joint action plan. If a deal were reached and Iran ever cheated, the United States and Israel would have much broader backing for any military action. And I personally would favor a suggestion from Robert Einhorn that in the wake of any comprehensive agreement, Congress should legislate prior authority to the president for military force in the event there is clear evidence that Iran is cheating again and violating the agreement reached. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we're not debating the nature of the Iranian regime here. The Islamic Republic is authoritarian, it's intermittently brutal, it's hostile to the United States, and it's hostile to Israel. Because it's not a monolith, it's also many other things, which perhaps we can get into later. But the issue here is not the nature of the regime. It's how to deal with this government, make Israel more secure, make the world more secure, and slowly prod it in the direction we seek. That is called, last time I checked, diplomacy. And diplomacy, the most important diplomacy, is not conducted with our friends. It's conducted with our enemies. And nor are we debating who exactly the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is. I heard his vile denial of the Holocaust. I heard the other provocative statements he's made recently. But he's also spoken of heroic flexibility in securing a deal with the 6 major powers on the Iranian nuclear program. So I say, let's test him. Let's see.
Thank you, Roger.
One last word, if I may, Jason.
Roger.
Literally 30 seconds. I just want to say that I've just returned from Vietnam, where almost 4 decades ago, another war without victory ended with the loss of more than 58,000 Americans. My grandson, Max Tran Cohen, now aged 1 week, was born there. It's not easy, I might remark, to get a circumcision. He was born into a country that's now pro-American, pro-free market, uneasy about China. Lo and behold, Vietnam's real enemy all along turned out to be China, dynamic and full of hope. It's amazing what can happen when barriers falls, and it's sobering, as the last decade has reminded us, what can go wrong once wars begin, especially those engendered by rash saber-rattling, flawed historical analogies, and ignorance. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. We've run a little bit over. Bret, you take as much time as you like.
Good, we have about 40 minutes. I'd like to thank the AJC for having us again. It's very gracious of you to listen to us twice. I want to thank Roger for his graciousness just now, even if he plays for time almost as well as the Iranians do in nuclear negotiations. Nothing that we say here, none of the words that we exchange should be treated as personal remarks. When I say that Roger is clinically insane, you should take it with a grain of salt. I will try to stick to my allotted time because this is supposed to be a debate, not an exchange of monologues. So let me make a few points. I wish I could live in the beautiful fantasy world that Roger Cohen inhabits. It's the fantasy world that he inhabited in 2009 when he visited Iran before those contested elections, now completely forgotten by him, wrote pans to the moderation of the regime under Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, whom he'd like us all now conveniently to forget was president of Iran for 8 years, during which Iran made so much of its massive nuclear progress, and now envisions a bright new world in which things are looking better, and anyway, what choice do we have but to pretend that things are looking better? My job here is to tell you that the interim agreement that was signed initialed in November, signed in January, and may lead to a final agreement either in July at the end or at the end of this year, is a road to ruin. Now, it's important to define what ruin is. And let me try to spell it out for you. First of all, it is an Iran with a nuclear weapon. This is as certain as it was certain that when Bill Clinton signed an agreed framework with Kim Il-sung, thinking that things were about to change in that regime in North Korea, that things would work out his way. They did not. North Korea has become a nuclear weapons state, a proliferator, a threat to the world, and we are about to reprise that sad experience with the Iranians. Secondly, it is a guarantee of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. If you think you're uncomfortable with Pakistan with a nuclear weapon, if you think you'll be uncomfortable with Iran with a nuclear weapon, think of how you're going to feel when it's not just Pakistan, Iran, but Saudi Arabia, Turkey, maybe Algeria, perhaps at some distant point, Egypt. Are we really comfortable with a world in which the most unstable, fanatical regimes all have nuclear weapons, and each of them is at daggers drawn with the other? Thirdly, what you are guaranteeing with this interim agreement and with any final agreement is a complete loss of American credibility and leverage in the region. Remember, this agreement was supposed to make the Iranians more pliable when it came to negotiating with us. Well, what have we seen? What is the evidence of the last few weeks? Roger just spoke of the importance of looking at actions, not words, right? We have seen an Iran that tried to deliver huge munitions through the Cloth Sea that was intercepted by Israel. Conveniently forgotten by all because inconvenient data doesn't suit Roger's thesis, but there it is. We have seen Iran full-throatedly supporting a regime in Damascus that is responsible for the death of 150,000 people. We have seen a regime in Iran that has been increasing the number of executions. Since Mr. Rouhani, Hassan Rouhani, became president, there have been more than 600 executions in Iran, a considerable uptick since Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, from the time when Ahmadinejad was president. There are 307 religious prisoners in Iran, again, unprecedented. 92 human rights prisoners, 200 ethnic minorities imprisoned by the regime. This is a regime that is more repressive than ever. And by the way, Roger just told you, don't worry about the internal character of the regime. What matters is its behavior. I worry about nothing except the internal character of the regime. I do not stay awake at night thinking that Francois Hollande has his finger on the button. He has his finger on other buttons, but not that button.
Let's hope so.
We worry about Iran with a nuclear capability because we know how this regime has behaved from the moment it was born 35 years ago, first by taking our diplomats, 52 of our diplomats, hostage in Tehran, and the rest is well known to all of you, from its terrorism in Berlin to Buenos Aires to a recent attempt not so long ago here in Washington, D.C. to blow up a restaurant and kill the Saudi ambassador. I would submit to you that a regime that is prepared to act like that without the benefit of a nuclear weapon will act much more severely and much more confidently should it have a nuclear weapon. Fourth, if we allow this deal to go through, Israel's options, and these are things we all care about, Roger included, Israel's options will be sharply limited because any deal that Iran will ink will be simply unacceptable to an Israeli government. Any deal that Iran will ink will guarantee their enrichment capabilities. Any deal that Iran will ink will not have any effect on the number of ballistic missiles that they intend to produce. And just the other day, the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei promised or urged his Revolutionary Guards to start mass producing ballistic missiles. So this is the ruin that I think we are getting ourselves into by telling ourselves a fantasy that this deal has any legs. You know, just the other day, Reuters, a news source I don't think any of us typically contests, had an interesting story. It said Iran's pursuit of illicit materials appears to slow amid nuclear talks. Wonderful news. But then quoting an IAEA document, it says, the report cautioned, quote, this may be a function of more sophisticated procurement strategies on the part of Iran, which has developed methods of concealing procurement while expanding prohibited activities. Such methods can also be used by Iran to procure and finance legitimate trade, which further complicates the efforts of states to identify illicit procurement. So the deal that Roger is going to propose that we should sign is one that we know Iran is already violating as we speak. As we speak, they are cheating on this deal. None of you in your private or business lives would sign an agreement with someone you know cheats time and again. So why should we have a diplomacy that signs an agreement with someone we know and we have demonstrated cheats time and again? Ask yourself that question before giving yourself over to this pleasant fantasy that Roger has just depicted. Now, he likes to say that my alternative, the only alternative that I'm proposing, is war. That's simply not true. There's a whole world of options, and it's very convenient for Roger to create this straw man that if you're not for his solution, you are for war. There's a world of options between that and what he is proposing. But let's not forget that what we are trying to do here is not avoid a war. We are trying to prevent one of the world's most barbaric regimes, a regime that hangs gay people, hangs people who are, quote, enemies of God, stones women to death. We are trying to prevent that kind of regime from gaining a nuclear weapon. That is our goal, not avoiding war. You should remember, and this is a prime minister that no doubt Roger would sometimes like to forget, but we in America remember him. We should remember the words of a former British prime minister who once said, and yes, I'm bringing up that hoary reminder of a certain period of time, you were given a choice between war and dishonor. You have chosen dishonor. You will have war. Ladies and gentlemen, do not choose dishonor. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for those, for both of those opening remarks. I've got a few questions to pose, and I also will invite questions from the audience and also from our audience around the world on the internet. So if you have questions that you would like to submit, you may tweet them to us, and if you are in the audience, please fill out the cards, pass them forward, and we will get to that in just a few minutes. Let me begin with a couple of questions. Roger, I'd like to start with you. As I think it's quite clear from the conversation that we've been having, Iranian leaders themselves could not be clearer. They say again and again, from the Supreme Leader to the Atomic Energy Agency head to the current president and foreign minister, they insist that Iran won't disassemble or disable elements of its nuclear infrastructure. How can a deal that leaves all the machinery in place, that doesn't involve the dismantling of centrifuges and other nuclear facilities, and that at very least implies an Iranian right to enrichment, how can that kind of deal be anything but a bad deal?
Well, the essential thing that Iran has to provide in any deal is transparency, complete transparency and intensive inspection. And it is clear that there will not be a deal unless the quantity of low-enriched uranium that Iran has currently is substantially reduced, and the number of centrifuges currently standing at around 19,000 goes down to a much lower figure. There are numbers circulating, perhaps 3,000, maximum 5,000. The absolute imperative in any deal, and this is front and center with the Obama administration, is that any breakout by Iran, the breakout time for Iran in moving from its current knowledge and capacity to the actual manufacture of a bomb or a deliverable device, that is made so long that in the interim there would be time to avert it. So clearly there's not, Jason, going to be a deal unless there is partial dismantlement of the program where it stands today. Now, I listened with interest to Bret over the several minutes that he spoke for, and it may have been due to my clinical insanity, but I was unable to follow his reasoning. He said that there were a world of options. There was a world of options between the current proposed deal and war. And then of that world of options, he listed precisely none. Zero. None whatsoever. He argued that this deal was the surest way to guarantee that Iran gets a nuclear weapon. Wrong, ladies and gentlemen. The surest way to ensure that Iran gets a nuclear weapon is to go on with what's been going on for the past 10 years. That's to say, the multiplication of centrifuges, the gradual amassing of uranium enriched to 3.5, and until the interim deal, 20%, the proliferation of hidden sites, the cheating, and so on. Don't be fooled into thinking that strong sanctions can somehow stop this advance. The way to ensure Iran gets a bomb is to do nothing, to do what we've done over the past several years. So in fact, although he didn't say it, what Bret is arguing for, I mean, at least be consistent, at least be honest and forthright, what he is arguing for is a military strike to set back this progress. Now, I won't go into, again, all the reasons why I think that's a terrible idea. But you should be clear in your heads that that is what he is proposing. And he hasn't laid it out or justified it.
Bret, you'd like to respond?
Yes, I'd love to. Since I've been reading management manuals, I've come across a very interesting one that provides the following negotiating advice. A few relevant quotations. If you don't bare your teeth, you're going to have troubles all over the world. If you threaten him with military force, he'll kiss your hand and run. One comment. Here's another comment. If someone stands strong opposite to him, he will retreat 100 steps. If he is strong and someone weak faces him, he will advance 100 steps. Unfortunately, you have taken a mistaken approach. You have been soft to him. Had you been tougher, your hand would be on top. Now, who provided this sage advice? It was Hassan Rouhani in 1986, talking to an Israeli agent by the name of Amiran Nir, who was posing as an American official just before or during what became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. As far as I know, those quotations are not controverted. This was Hassan Rouhani's advice for how the United States ought to deal with the regime of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And I would suggest to you that it is precisely the right advice that we should be following today. Another wonderful Churchill quote, better jaw than war. We are going out of our way to telegraph our weakness, to telegraph our hunger for any negotiated settlement with the Iranians. Now, I want to admit to an error that I made earlier over the last few years. I was very skeptical, Roger, of the efficacy of economic sanctions and their success in doing genuinely great damage to Iran and actually forcing the Iranians to start making at least some signs that they were prepared to negotiate in good faith. But just at the moment, last November, when we were increasing our leverage, we gave that leverage away. We bargained it away for nothing, or almost nothing. Pottage.
I'm glad you said almost nothing rather than nothing.
It's the American Jewish Committee, so I need a biblical reference. So we bargained it away. Now, it's going to be very hard to reclaim. And one of the terrible things about this agreement is that, contrary to what President Obama has said, it's not going to be so easy to ratchet those sanctions back up to where they were. Already, countries around the world are eyeing trade opportunities with Iran. It will be extremely difficult to do that. But we can massively tighten sanctions on Iran's central bank, to make them feel genuine pain, to put the Iranian leadership to a fundamental choice. Do they want nuclear weapons or a nuclear weapons capability? Or do they want to stay in power? Those are some of the serious options, short of an actual military confrontation, that we should be pursuing, as opposed to this fantasy that's being carried out in Vienna.
Very good. Bret, thank you. I think going forward, in the next question that I'm going to pose, and then the questions that are already starting to come in over the internet and from the participants, let's set a 2-minute time limit on our responses. Bret, a question to you. And I think I know the answer because I read your column this morning in the Wall Street Journal. U.S. officials, from the president on down, routinely say that all options regarding Iran are on the table, which means that if deemed vital to protect our national interests and no better option is available, the United States is prepared to act militarily to stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. But does the United States today, in fact, pose a credible military threat to Iran? Or have we convinced the mullahs, after a bloody and expensive decade, of our lack of enthusiasm for military solutions to complicated international problems?
I will repeat what I said at the last debate. I've written 2 fan letters in my life. One was to Roald Dahl when I was 8 years old, and the other was to a journalist named Roger Cohen, who did the most exemplary journalism from Bosnia that I know of. And one of the wonderful pieces that he wrote was about Srebrenica and the massacre there, and the fecklessness of the United States in those early years. And I'm sure, although I don't know this, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, you cheered when the United States finally intervened militarily to end that terrible siege on Sarajevo, to end the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, to put an end to that despicable regime of Slobodan Milosevic. The same principles ought to apply, at least in some corner of your mind, when it comes to Iran. The problem with this president is that he is simply not credible. And you alluded to it in your opening remarks, that when he walked away from his red line in Syria, the game was up. People knew that he wasn't serious. And that is tragic for the United States, because if a president is not willing to do something relatively easy, like enforce a red line about the use of chemical weapons in Syria, he's certainly not going to be prepared to do something relatively hard, like potentially destroying or degrading Iran's nuclear capabilities. That's a great shame. It's another indication of the leverage that this administration has lost while pursuing this chimera, this mirage of a negotiated settlement.
Roger would like you to respond.
Well, thank you, Bret, on Bosnia. And yes, I was very much in favor, having lived through the Sarajevo siege for a couple of years, of the military action that put an end to that. And I agree with you that the credibility of American red lines is absolutely central to global security. And when a president sets down a red line and then backs away from it, that is extremely serious. Nevertheless, I don't think that a solution in one place or in one time, 20 years ago now in Bosnia, is necessarily applicable in another situation. And in the case of Iran, as I said at the beginning, I think we have to exhaust every diplomatic possibility, and that is what is in the process of being done right now. I also said that if Iran cheats on that deal, if a permanent one were ever in place, I would be in favor of Congress pre-authorizing use of military force. So that is the situation as I see it. And you should recall, Bret, that these powerful sanctions that they were not put in place by George W. Bush. They were put in place by President Obama.
Yeah.
And how did we get to that point? We got to that point, I would submit, by the president saying, and the world hearing, words to the effect of, we will unclench our fist if you, Supreme Leader Khamenei, will unclench yours. And it was when the world saw that despite the good faith offer of the United States, the Iranian regime was not prepared to do anything, that China and Russia and others began to cooperate. Unlike you, however, I do not believe that we are in a position today in the world of the 20th century to force Iran, through military power or otherwise, to completely dismantle its nuclear program and unknow somehow what it now knows. What we have to be focused on is making this program extremely limited, confined to civilian use, intensely monitored and verified at every possible stage. And that is how to stop Iran moving toward a nuclear weapon. It is not to say, let's just go on as before, maybe with slightly stronger sanctions, and it is not to start raining bombs on Iran.
Thank you, Robert. Bret, back to you. The interim joint plan of action provided Iran limited sanctions relief, $6 to $7 billion by official estimates, although reports have suggested a higher number. The ink on the interim deal was hardly dry before trade negotiations started showing up in Tehran to explore post-sanctions business opportunities. Between the factor of the possibility of those trade delegations coming back home and lobbying their governments to ease pressure on Iran, between that factor and the growing tensions between Russia and the other P5+1 partners, can the P5+1 maintain sufficient solidarity and sufficient pressure to deal with Iran?
I don't know. It's an impossible question to answer. The P5+1 is a very unwieldy mechanism for negotiating with the Iranians. As to the first part of your question, actually simply made the point that I would have made, in fact, did make earlier, that one of the first things that happened when we inked this foolish and premature deal, was that we lost one of the great levers of power that we had over Iran, which was the economic pressure. I want to correct you on one point, because the truth of the matter for anyone, and many of you in this room were probably intimately involved in making sure those tough sanctions got passed. You know very well that they were shoved down the throat of the Obama administration at the end of 2010. Later, the Obama administration took credit for it, and I'm happy for them to take credit for good things even if they didn't do them. But it was essentially forced down their throat by members of Congress. I wish they had acted earlier and not wasted 2 years pursuing fruitless diplomatic approaches with Iran. One final point that I want to make in the 17 seconds that I have left. I want to put you on the table, Roger, saying that if you do not get a deal that brings Iran down to, say, 3,000 or 4,000 centrifuges, maybe 5 or 6, that creates a window between at least a year long between what Iran has and how it can break out, that provides truly solid monitoring and verification mechanisms, then in that case, if that deal is not available, then you will start writing columns making the case for war against Iran, because you know as well as I do that this is one regime that cannot be allowed under any circumstances to get anywhere near a nuclear weapons capability.
Roger?
It's already near a nuclear weapons capability, Bret. It's already pretty much there, as you know. What I said is that I did not say what you just said. What I said was that if a deal is reached and inked, and if Iran then reneges on it, starts cheating on it, and is clearly heading toward the actual fabrication of a nuclear weapon, then I would favor Congress pre-authorizing the use of force, and I would, in that case, write in favor of the use of force, because it would then be demonstrated that every diplomatic option had failed, that all the Iranian fatwas from the highest levels about Iran being a country that does not seek a nuclear weapon. All the statements from Rouhani, Javad Zarif, his foreign minister, saying that Iran in no circumstances will pursue a nuclear weapon, and that is in the Joint Action Plan. Those very words are in the plan, right at the beginning of it, that Iran will not seek a nuclear weapon. If Iran, in effect, tears up a deal right after it's signed or within the time frame of the deal, which I think should be at least 10 years, if that were to happen, then yes, I would favor the use of military force. What I don't favor is a rush to war. And what will this war achieve? You haven't said that. What do you think this war could possibly achieve, other than the further isolation of Israel, the greater insecurity of Israel, the entire Middle East in complete turmoil, oil prices going I don't know where, more danger, more instability, more economic hardship. And that's what you want, Bret. And I think you want it with too much levity.
Before we go to the question of what would military action look like, which is something that has been proposed by a member of our audience, I'd like to come back to something, Roger, that you wrote 4 years ago, before our last debate, in which you talked about the different options that we have to deal with Iran, and you were actually favoring at that time not regime change, but trying to help the Green Movement and help the political forces inside Iran force a change in policy. Have we given up any possibility of a fundamental change in the nature of the Iranian regime?
Well, I think we put it in abeyance for now, that's for sure. And I restrained myself when Bret said that I'd forgotten the events of 2009, because along with Bosnia, those moments were among the most powerful, moving and troubling that I've ever witnessed as a journalist, seeing millions of Iranians in the streets of Tehran in June 2009, rising up to demand that their votes be counted in what was a fraudulent election. And it was a failing of our president not to have come out much more forcefully at that time to make clear that this was a movement that was standing for American values, for freedom, and for elections that are actually genuine elections. So I've not forgotten it, Bret, not by any means. Now, as to what's become of the Green Movement, well, it's been pushed brutally beneath the surface, but that sentiment is still there. And one of the things that I find hard to accept in the many columns of Bret's that I read about Iran is what I consider to be his, well, he hasn't been there, but I don't feel he has much sense of the reality of Iranian society. He has this trope that you've heard about the stoning of women and about the cruelty of the regime, and this is true. It is also true that there are millions of Iranians in college. More than half of them are women. This is a society that has phases of liberalization, phases of being closed down again. It is a society in many ways ready for democracy. And Jason, one of the reasons that I take the position I've taken is that you don't know. We know this through China, we know this through Vietnam, to which I alluded. We don't know what happens when you get a breach, when you begin to have contact with a country. And this has just begun in the case of Iran. But I am convinced that the most likely way to bring forward the forces of youth, the forces of change, the forces standing for the values that we here in this room embrace, the most potent way to bring those forces forward is to try to open toward Iran, to try to make this deal as a tiny breach. And the most potent way to entrench for at least a generation the very repressive and authoritarian forces that we oppose, the most certain way to entrench them for a generation is to bomb Iran.
Thank you, Roger. Bret, you need to respond.
Yeah, it's true I haven't been to Iran. I just came back from 2 weeks in Afghanistan, if that's of any interest, but that's another story. I'll tell you why I haven't been to Iran. I'm the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. I haven't been to Iran because...
My name is Roger Cohen.
Yes. You applaud, but it's not cute, because they are making distinctions. That regime is making distinctions between journalists they believe are sympathetic and journalists they know are hostile. And that's why they took Roxana Saberi prisoner. And that's why they took 3 American backpackers, Shane Bauer and 2 others, prisoners for 18 months in Evin prison. That's why they routinely arrest American dual nationals, Mrs. Esfandiari here in Washington somewhere. Many Iranian Americans, Robert Levinson. So the reason I don't go to Iran is a strictly prudential one. Unlike Roger, because of my biography, I run serious risks. So that's why I haven't been to Iran. But I don't think that I'm seeing Iran through whatever the opposite of rose-tinted glasses are. I think I'm seeing Iran for what it is. When Roger went to Iran and talked about the stupendous condition of Iranian Jews there, or the relatively stupendous condition, I know he had some caveats and exceptions and throat clearings, that was seeing a different form of Iran. That was seeing an Iran that the regime wanted to present. And your reporting after the events of June was magnificent, Roger, but your reporting before the events of June was blind. And that point needs to be made and remembered, because you are blind again. Now, you talk about a rush to war. We have been negotiating with the Iranians in multiple fora, at the UN, through the EU3, through Brazil and Turkey, through the P5+1, for over 10 years. Iran's nuclear programs were first, illegal nuclear programs were first exposed to the world in late 2002. It has been 12 years that we've been talking about this. And Roger keeps saying rush to war. It's been 12 years that this crisis has been brewing, with Roger saying, don't rush to war, don't rush to war. 12 years. Another thing that Roger used to like to say is, oh, the neocons like Stephens keep warning that an Iranian nuclear capability is right around the corner, and it keeps receding and receding. We now know that was thanks to things like Stuxnet and other interventions. But even now, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, talks about the Iranians being potentially within a 2-month breakout period. Let me say one final thing. The thing that will entrench this regime more than anything is if it wins. Winner regimes tend to hold on to power. Loser regimes lose power. In 1982, a terrible junta in Argentina seized the Falklands War in order to rejuvenate its popularity. The Argentinians went wild in support for liberating Las Malvinas, as they called them. A British prime minister thought differently, evicted the Argentines, and Galtieri and his thugs were gone within a week. In 1999, a brave American president named Bill Clinton defied isolationists in Congress, including many Republicans, and made sure that ethnic cleansing would not happen in Kosovo. Milosevic, it was common wisdom that if you bombed Kosovo, it would just entrench Milosevic in power. He was gone within a year. You would think, by Roger's reasoning, that the Iranians are practically begging us to bomb them.
May I, Jason?
Very quickly, Roger.
We know what happens when Iran is attacked. Iran was attacked in 1980 by Saddam Hussein. The entire Iranian people coalesced to fight back, and to suggest, as Bret sometimes does, that somehow we drop a bomb or two and the Iranian people will rise up and cheer and overthrow the Islamic Republic, I think is foolhardy. There is no way, in my view, that that's going to happen. If I could very quickly correct you, Bret, I never referred to the condition of the Iranian Jews as stupendous. You can search for that word in any column of mine, you will not find it. My point at the time was merely that the Jewish community of Iran exists. It is the largest Jewish community in the Muslim Middle East. And at the time I was there, right after the Israeli incursion in Gaza, you will recall that synagogues in Paris, Caracas, Lyon, elsewhere, were being desecrated. I was doing what reporters do. I was wandering around Tehran and Esfahan through the Jewish quarters with their Stars of David in the window, and it just struck me that at that moment in time when this was happening elsewhere, nothing was happening to any of these stores or any of these places or any of these synagogues. That is what I attempted to write about, to say that if you really believe that all Mahmoud Ahmadinejad thinks about is killing Jews night and day and at every opportunity he has, then you have to deal with something that appears to contradict that. The fact that this largest Jewish community in the Muslim Middle East exists and still exists today in Iran.
Thank you, Roger. Bret, if you would like a further rebuttal, you're entitled.
Well, everyone knows, I mean, to what Roger just said, I invite you to have conversation, and I'm sure some of you in this room belong to the Iranian Jewish community now in exile in places like Los Angeles and throughout the United States, just how Iranian Jews are treated. I'm glad that the comparison seems to be Yemen or Egypt. You're right. By that point of comparison,
well,
Iranian
it's certainly
Jews
not
are
New
doing
York City.
very well
No,
indeed.
it's
And
not
I did
New York
not
City,
say I did not put the word stupendous in quotation marks, but everyone remembers that column extremely well because it made such an extraordinary impression. We are not trying, when it comes to dealing with Iran's nuclear program, to win an argument, either between us or with you or with anyone else. We're not trying to prove to the world that we have exhausted every single diplomatic opportunity. We are trying to stop a singularly nasty regime from gaining weapons of mass destruction, starting an arms race in the Middle East, putting Israel critically in danger, and in the long run, putting the United States and all of us here in Washington, D.C. at risk. That is the goal. That is the goal. It's not to assemble a great coalition. It's not to make the best rhetorical case. It's to prevent this regime from getting nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, because by and large, not just this administration, but its predecessor administration, the Bush administration, was taking Roger Cohen's advice too often. Too often. They read the New York Times. It's a great paper. Art section is terrific.
Bret, thank you.
Because they did that, we have allowed what at first was a small crisis to become a global crisis. And the more we prevaricate, the more we wait, the more dangerous the situation will become for all of us.
A lot of very good applause lines are being uttered. I'd ask you to hold your applause until the very end. We talked about military options before. Let's drill down a little bit on military options. A question from the audience: are there credible, effective military options short of land invasion?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's preposterous to suppose. I mean, this is a point that I'm glad that we've come to, because Roger would have you believe that the only credible military option we have is a reprise of the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War. Tens of thousands of American soldiers fighting their way towards Tehran. That is absolutely preposterous. How many of you remember Operation Desert Fox? It was a 4-day bombing campaign that Bill Clinton undertook when he was being impeached in 1998 to what he degrade, as he thought, Iraq's weapons of mass destruction capability. We forget it. None of you remembered it. Maybe some of you. I doubt any of you remembered it. What we are talking about is a limited bombing campaign. Iran is not the Soviet Union. Iran is not China. This is a third world country with a relatively primitive nuclear capability. So the idea that if we should have to exercise a military option, that this would go on forever, is simply, well, I don't want to say it's simply mistaken. It's improbable. Now, there hasn't been a military strike in history that hasn't had unforeseen consequences. And this could very well have unforeseen consequences. And those unforeseen consequences can be very unpleasant. They could mine the Straits of Hormuz. They could attack Israel with missiles. They could bomb a Jewish cultural center once again. This is the sort of stuff this regime does. But what the choice before you is to weigh, not some unforeseen consequences, whatever they may be, but to weigh the difference between those unforeseen consequences and the perfectly foreseeable consequences of what happens in a world where Iran has a nuclear capability. And I would submit to you, and this is the nub of our disagreement here, I would submit to you that that world of Iran as a nuclear weapons state is far worse than whatever set of unforeseen consequences might emerge from a limited, effective military strike on what amounts to a handful of nuclear sites in a third world country attempting to develop nuclear weapons. We are not fighting World War IV. We are not fighting the Iraq War. We are doing what essentially an enlarged version of what Israel did so effectively in 1981, and again in 2007. And think of the world we would have if Israel had not acted in, say, 2007, and this Assad regime, instead of using chemical weapons against its people, might have been using nuclear weapons instead.
Thank you, Bret. Roger, would you like to respond?
Well, Bret, I noticed there that what you did not say in all those words was what would happen with Iran's nuclear program as a result of these perfect pinpoint strikes that you're proposing. All the experts that I've read or talked to say that at best the program might be put back 6 months to a year, maybe 18 months. At that point, you have the Iranian population more united than ever around this program. You presumably have Iran tearing up the NPT, throwing out the IAEA inspectors, no more inspection, no more possibility of knowing on the ground what Iran is doing. And quite likely Iran says, well, what do we have to lose? Let's rush for a bomb. I've seen Bret in one column say 24 hours of strikes should do it. I mean, this is nonsense. This would have to go on for at least a week. If it was simple, Bret just alluded to other strikes by Israel, effective strikes in Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere. If it was simple, if it was straightforward, Israel would have done it. Look at the number of times Prime Minister Netanyahu and others have said, we are at the red line. We've been at the red line for a decade or more, if you look at the statements. And the reason, one of the reasons, principal reasons, why Israel has held back is it's very difficult. It's very complicated. And it's very hard to know if this would be effective in any way. Bret alluded to the possible repercussions. I think it's very hard to imagine that whatever was done would be somehow confined to a week of bombing. No, there would be escalation. You'd see Hezbollah involved. You might, as Bret said, see activity in the Straits of Hormuz. You would see unpleasant things happening in Afghanistan, possibly even more, if it's possible, unpleasant things in Syria, troubles in Iraq. Iran's capability of making trouble throughout the region is very great. So I think the idea of limited pinprick strikes that are neatly tied with a bow and do the job, I don't find that persuasive.
Thank you. Let's very quick rebuttal.
Just very briefly, what's interesting is that having told you that military strikes are really not at all reasonable, this is the same Roger Cohen who just told you that Congress should pre-order or pre-authorize the military strikes he's just explained could never work. So the truth is that you're not really serious when you talk about this pre-authorization. It's more by way of a feint.
No.
So hang on. So wait. So just 1 second. Let me just finish up my minute and 33, 32, 31 seconds. Okay. I'm not talking about an Israeli military strike on Israel, which would be, as I have written, at the outer circumference of all of its capabilities. I'm talking about an American military strike on Iran. That's the point that I'm making. Now, all this being said, we've all gotten sucked into this discussion about military strikes. I think that if we need to prevent Iran from acquiring or getting anywhere near acquisition of nuclear weapons, military strikes ought to be a serious option on the table and not the phony, bogus military option that Roger is proposing. Military option by way of congressional hortatory resolution, which may or may not be enforced. That being said, I remind you, the point of this debate is to talk about the interim nuclear deal. And I stand by the assertion that I made earlier, that there is a universe of options somewhere between simply accepting whatever deal we can get with the Iranians and World War IV that we should be entertaining, that we should be pushing. But by opting for Roger's course, a diplomacy we know at some stage is bound to fail, even if an agreement is reached, we are guaranteeing the worst possible outcome, which is an Iran with nuclear weapons.
Bret, I'm sorry, your universe of options is reverting to sanctions backed by the threat of military force, which is where we've been for the past decade and has produced 19,000 centrifuges in the place of 300 at the beginning of the Bush administration. That is what you are proposing. More sanctions and the threat of military force. That's where we've been for a decade. It's this potential deal that takes us beyond that to a place where Iran is far less likely to obtain a nuclear weapon.
Let's hold further responses until closing, which is coming up.
Wait, but sorry, there is, just very briefly, and this is a point where Roger and I will agree.
What is your universe of options?
Okay, one of the tragedies is that this administration has done nothing to keep the Green Movement alive since 2009. Why are we not putting moral pressure on the Iranians? Why are we not highlighting the poets, the human rights activists, the ethnic minorities who are being repressed all the time? One of the most effective methods by which the United States and the West won the Cold War was to support solidarity every way we could. You know that struggle intimately. Those are things that we should be doing. We should be putting the heat on the Iranians. We should be ostracizing and shaming that regime and shaming them instead of making Javad Zarif this pig who puts a wreath on the grave of Imad Bugnia, the man who was responsible for the Beirut bombings in 1983, instead of laughing with him at Vienna as if he's this terrific guy. We should be shaming and ostracizing that regime and reminding the world every single day of what this regime is all about, and we do none of that. We entertain them and we fet them in Vienna and Geneva. That's one of the things, one of the tools that we should be using. So don't caricature what you'd like to have me say. You know, there are many things that we can be doing, all the way up to and including a serious military option.
Gentlemen, there are more questions. There are more questions from the audience. I have some more as well, but we're pretty much out of time, so we're going to go to closing statements right now. We'll give each of you 3 minutes. Roger, you're first.
Well, you've seen our disagreement here. The reason that I believe this is a potential path to progress is that it's very important for global security to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And the best way to do that at this point is through this potential deal, which would ring-fence the capacity that Iran currently has, render their program visible and transparent, and ensure that, as Henry Kissinger and George Shultz said in that quote from them that I read to you, that all that Iran is left with is something that can only be consistent with a limited civilian nuclear program. The alternative, as I said 4 years ago, is unthinkable. I don't think that Bret has made a persuasive case for any other option. War, at this stage, given where the American psyche is right now, given the situation in the Middle East, given any reasonable assessment of what could be obtained by a military strike, war is not an option until every possible diplomatic option is exhausted. And that is what the president is in the process of doing right now. I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that we won't get... Rouhani is a regime insider. Zarif is too. But the Islamic Republic is not going away in a hurry. And I think these two men are the best interlocutors that we can hope for. I think they are serious about trying to make a deal. The final arbiter will be Khamenei. The president has put the chances at 50-50. I would say they're probably less than that, because any deal has to be rigorous, verifiable, and it has to slash Iran's current nuclear capacity. It's a huge risk also for Khamenei to move from Marba America, death to America. This has been one of the pillars of the regime, to the kind of breach I suggested, which could force an evolution in Iranian society in the direction that I think Bret and I both want to see it move in. So given those options, the best one, without question, the only likely path to progress toward a more open Iran whose nuclear program has been effectively curtailed and turned into a transparent civilian program, the best option is to pursue this diplomacy and try to see if in the next 3 months or 6 months we can get to a deal that I think should be concluded for at least 10 years. The Middle East presents countless problems and conundrums. As we've seen in Egypt, Syria, and elsewhere, the outcomes are often disappointing. The outcome in 2009 was tragic and deeply disappointing. Nevertheless, Iran is a country that has been seeking democracy since 1905. It is a nation, if you know it, that is, beneath the surface, full of hope, full of highly educated people who do not want to be pariahs, who are thirsting for contact with the United States. Here in the US, we have, in the Iranian diaspora, one of the most successful diaspora communities in the country. And to release this potential of Iran, to get over the 3-decades-old trauma of American-Iranian estrangement, the way forward, the path to progress, is to conclude this deal.
Thank you, Roger. Bret.
The trauma isn't the estrangement. The trauma is the regime. In the 1920s, Secretary of State for a Republican administration signed something called the Pact of Paris, which is better known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which had the wonderful effect of outlawing war forever. It was signed by Japan, it was signed by Germany, it was signed by the Soviet Union, it was signed by the United States, it was signed by fascist Italy. And within a year, Japan was invading Manchuria, and a few years after that, Italy was invading Ethiopia, and then Germany was taking Czechoslovakia, and so on. Now, I'm not trying to say here that Iran is Nazi Germany. I am trying to say that it is dangerous for the United States, as the world's only serious liberal power, to conduct a foreign policy based on wishes. I wish that I could agree with Roger. I wish that the deal that he paints is a remotely realistic deal. I wish that we did not have 35 years of bitter experience with this regime, learning exactly what it is about. I wish that the Iranian regime, not the people, the regime, wanted a better future, not simply to dominate the rest of the region, not to propagate an Islamic republic, not to put forward the word of the Imam Khomeini, not to have as a president a man who said just a year ago, it is not enough to say death to America in words. We must say death to America in action. Those are the words of Hassan Rouhani, the moderate in the Iranian political context. I wish those things weren't true. And then we could conduct a beautiful diplomacy. But neither as Americans and the leaders of the free world, nor for most of us in the room as Jews, and long the victims of the great powers of the world, can we afford to indulge a diplomacy of fantasy and illusion when it comes to this regime. We have to be sober, we have to be hard-headed, we have to avoid the caricatures of painting some people as people of a party of peace and others as the party of war. Above all, we have to make sure that a regime whose supreme leader has said Israel is a cancer that should be cut and must be cut, should not acquire the tools to do that awful job. We have lived through a century in which we should have learned, contrary to what Roger said at the beginning, that words too often lead to action. So let's take the Iranians, at least when they say those things, at their word, and approach this matter with the seriousness that it deserves, with sobriety, with wisdom, and above all, with courage. Thank you very much.
You know, when you produce a sequel, you never quite know how it's going to turn out. I would say that round 2 lived up to our expectations. Serious, civilized, very sharp debate, and entirely thanks to the thoughtfulness and the eloquence and the passion of our 2 debaters. Thank you, Roger Cohen. Thank you, Bret Stephens. Thank you all for being part of this.